At 18, I thought I just wasn't good enough for college. No acceptance letters ever came, so I buried the dream and spent 10 years trapped in my parents' auto shop. Then a leak in our attic exposed a dusty box with my name on it, and a stack of secrets my parents had hidden for a decade. I grew up in a town where the only things that really mattered were Friday night football and who you were related to. We had one main street, two stoplights, and a blinking sign outside the diner that never quite worked right. People married their high school sweethearts, took jobs at the mill, and measured success by the size of their truck and whether they could afford a boat to drag to the lake on weekends. From as early as I can remember, I knew I didn't fit into that script. While other kids were practicing tackles behind the bleachers, I was in the library, hunched over thick used textbooks the school librarian let me borrow from the college prep shelf. I read about quantum physics before I'd ever seen the ocean, learned what an endowment was before I'd ever heard anybody use the word investment without a sneer. My name is Noah, and I was supposed to leave that town when I was 18. At least, that's what every teacher, every counselor, and every instinct in my chest told me. At home, though, it was a different story. My parents weren't bad people in the way movies like to paint villains. They paid bills on time. They went to church on Sundays. They didn't drink, didn't hit us, didn't leave. But they were small. Small in their expectations, small in their world, and absolutely suffocating in the way they clung to the life they thought everyone should live. My father, Mark, ran a small auto repair shop he'd inherited from his dad. My mother, Diane, worked the front desk, took the calls, kept the books. They were proud of what they'd built, and in their minds there was only one path forward for me: graduate high school, skip college, and take my rightful place in the family business. It wasn't a conversation. It was an assumption carved into our lives like something written in concrete before I'd even learned to spell my own name. "You've got good hands," Dad used to say, watching me replace a carburetor as a 14-year-old. "Real steady. This shop will be twice the place when you're running it with me." He meant it as a compliment. I heard it as a sentence. Mom's version was softer, but just as binding. "College is for people who don't have a safety net," she'd say while folding laundry, her fingers moving in sharp, practiced motions. "We already have a business. Why would you go off and throw money at some university that just wants to brainwash you and send you back in debt?" If she'd said that once, maybe I could have shrugged it off, but it was constant. At breakfast, in the car, whispered at church when she saw some kid in a hoodie with a university logo walk past. The message was always the same: college is not for people like us. College is not for people like you. Only, my teachers strongly disagreed. In sophomore year, Mrs. Patel, my math teacher, called me after class. Her glasses slipped down her nose as she studied a test I'd finished in half the allotted time. "Noah, have you ever thought about engineering?" she asked. I laughed, because in my house the word engineer meant guy who works on engines. "I already do that," I said. She smiled in a way that made my face heat with embarrassment. "No," she said gently, "not that kind of engineer. I'm talking about designing things from the ground up. Bridges, planes, circuits. You think 3 steps ahead of the problem. That's rare." That was the first time someone looked at me and saw something beyond grease-stained hands and a fixed life path. That year, my guidance counselor, Mr. Jenkins, started shoving brochures at me, glossy photos of stone buildings and green quads, smiling students sprawled under trees. One brochure from a university 3 states away stuck with me. It wasn't just the pictures. It was the way the course list read like a menu of everything I'd ever wanted: theoretical physics, applied mathematics, computer science. "You could get in here," Jenkins said, tapping the university's crest with his pen. "Hell, with your grades and test scores, you could probably get in with a scholarship." At home, the brochures never made it to the kitchen table. I kept them under my mattress, flattened out at night with shaking hands, tracing the letters of the university's name with my finger, whispering it under my breath like a prayer. I knew better than to bring them into the open. One evening, Mom walked into my room without knocking and caught the blue glow of my laptop as I typed out an essay. I clicked the window closed, faster than I'd ever moved in my life, but she'd already seen enough. "What are you working on?" she asked, voice sharp. Just school stuff, I lied. She stepped closer, eyes narrowing. You're not still wasting time on that nonsense, are you? By that nonsense, she meant the college search, the applications, the possibility of a life beyond the shop's oil-stained concrete floor. I swallowed. It's just an assignment, Mom. She stared at me for another long second, then sighed. You're too old to be daydreaming. Your father needs you at the shop after school. We can't have you slacking off because you think you're going to run off to some fancy campus. I nodded, eyes on my shoes, heart pounding. I wish I could say I stood up then, that I said something brave. I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I got smaller. I started writing essays at the library. I made sure every brochure stayed hidden. I erased my browser history like I was covering up something dirty. When application season rolled around senior year, I did everything in secret. I wrote my personal statements on lunch breaks, hunched over a school computer. I bribed Mr. Jenkins with coffee to let me use his office printer to get my transcripts. I asked teachers for recommendation letters, begging them to send them directly, bypassing my parents entirely. I memorized deadlines. I triple-checked mailing addresses. I dug up fee waiver forms because God knew there was no way my parents would pay $60 or $70 per application. Every envelope I sent felt like I was both betraying my family and saving myself. In the tiny, echoing hallway outside the post office, I stood there with a stack of thick white envelopes in my hands. My name printed in block letters, the university's name printed above the address window. If anyone from town had walked in right then, I might have lost my nerve. Instead, it was just me and the humming vending machine, the faint smell of paper and dust. I slid each envelope into the outgoing mail slot, listened to the dull thunk as it fell out of reach, and forced myself to breathe. There. It was done. After that, waiting became my full-time job. Every day after school, I walked home a little faster, my pulse climbing as our house came into view. Every creak of the porch, every clank of the overused mailbox lid felt like it could be the moment. In my imagination, I could see it perfectly. Thick envelopes with university crests, my name in clean black ink, the words, "We are pleased to inform you." But week after week, the only things in the mailbox were utility bills, cheap coupons, and the occasional church newsletter. At first, I thought it was normal. Maybe they took longer. Maybe the admissions office was swamped. Then I overheard other kids talking in the hallway. Got my acceptance from state last week, one of the football guys bragged. 3 letters already. A girl from my AP English class whispered to her friend. I'm still waiting on the one I really care about. The others were getting letters. Why wasn't I? I tried to be rational. Maybe the universities I'd aimed for were just more competitive. Maybe my essay hadn't been as strong as I thought. But late at night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop the doubts from curling through me like smoke. Had I messed something up? Put the wrong address? Forgotten a signature? Senior spring rolled on. The guidance office decorated a bulletin board with college logos and kids' names written underneath. It became a ritual to walk past and pretend not to care. Each day more names appeared. State schools, private colleges, even a couple of the big ones that made teachers' eyes light up. My name was never on those little printed slips of paper. Mr. Jenkins tried to keep me from noticing. He pulled me into his office once, closed the door, and sighed like he was carrying the weight of my future on his shoulders. "You're sure you put the right return address?" he asked. "Yes," I said too quickly. He glanced at me, then at the stack of files on his desk. "I haven't gotten word of any admissions decisions for you yet," he admitted. "But it's still early for some places. Don't lose hope." I nodded, but something inside me had already started to crack. At home, my parents pretended not to notice any of this. If they saw my eyes lingering on the mailbox when we got home late from the shop, they didn't say anything. If they heard the gnawing silence when people asked in church about my plans after graduation, they just smiled and changed the subject. Eventually, the silence turned into their own narrative. One evening in April, Dad was wiping his hands on an old rag at the shop when he said casually, "Jenkins called me today." I stiffened. "Oh?" He says you've been fixated on these college things. Mom, perched on a stool with a ledger in her lap, made a disapproving sound. I swallowed. He's just looking out for students. It's his job. Dad tossed the rag onto the bench, turned to face me. "Well, maybe you're just not cut out for that world," he said, his tone annoyingly gentle. "Not everyone gets in. They only take the very top. Nothing wrong with being average, son." The words hit harder because I knew they weren't true. I knew my grades, my scores. I knew that on paper I wasn't average. I thought. I started, then stopped. I could feel my voice shaking. "You thought what?" Mom cut in, her eyes never leaving the numbers in front of her. "That those places were just going to line up to throw money at you? Life doesn't work that way, Noah. We told you. We warned you not to expect too much." I stared at them, my throat tight. It was like watching someone casually set fire to the house you'd spent years building in your head. "Maybe it's a sign," Dad went on, turning back to the engine on the lift. "This is where you belong, with us, at the shop. Real work. Honest work. Honest work." The next day, when acceptance packets would have long since arrived for anyone who was going to get them, Mom told the lady at the grocery store checkout, "Oh, Noah decided not to go to college. He's going to stay and help with the business." She said it lightly, like it was just a fact of life. I stood there holding a bag of flour, feeling like my insides had gone hollow. That was how the story hardened. Not with a conversation, not with a family meeting, but with a casual lie repeated often enough to become truth. By the time graduation rolled around, I'd stopped checking the mailbox. I shook hands, smiled for pictures I never looked at again, and listened as kids read out their college destinations from the podium. It felt like I was watching them all step onto boats while I stayed stuck on the shore, pretending that was what I'd wanted all along. I took a full-time job at the shop that summer. Oil, metal, invoices, early mornings, late nights, joints aching in ways that didn't feel like the natural fatigue of hard work, but like the slow grind of something inside me wearing down. People in town smiled approvingly. "Good boy," they'd say. "Staying to help your folks. Not too proud to work with your hands." Inside I was screaming. I kept telling myself I'd try again next year, reapply, maybe to different schools, maybe to the same ones, maybe something online. But 1 year turned into two turned into 3. Life has a way of filling in the cracks until you can't remember where the original lines were. I watched my classmates leave for college and come back for holidays, full of stories about dorms and professors and midnight study sessions. Their worlds were expanding. Mine was shrinking. And then 10 years passed. 10 years of the same shop, the same town, the same expectations. 10 years of my parents acting like they'd done me a favor, like they'd saved me from debt and disappointment. 10 years of me waking up in a cold sweat sometimes, heart racing from dreams of brick arches and lecture halls I'd never seen. I might have gone on like that forever if it hadn't been for the leak in our attic. It was a stupid, mundane thing. A storm rolled through one spring, tearing shingles off the roof. Water sneaked down through unseen cracks, and one morning Mom shrieked because there were brown stains blooming on the hallway ceiling. Dad grumbled, pulled out the ladder and handed me a flashlight. "Get up there and see where it's coming from," he said. "If it's minor, we'll patch it ourselves." The attic was a low, dusty space that always smelled of old cardboard and insulation. I crawled across the beams carefully, my phone flashlight slicing through the dim. Dropped there near the leak, warped and slick with water, was an old cardboard box that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and I just never noticed. The side of the box had my name scrawled on it in black marker. I frowned, eyebrows pulling together. What would my parents have stored in a box with my name on it, up here in the dark? "You find anything?" Dad's voice floated up faintly through the hatch. "Yeah," I called back, voice tight. "Just give me a minute." I dragged the box away from the wet patch, pried the damp flaps open. The smell of old paper hit me first, then a strange wave of something like déjà vu. Inside, neatly stacked despite the moisture, were envelopes, dozens of them. Some still sealed, some torn open, all bearing university logos I recognized instantly. The crest of that school I'd once traced with my finger. Return addresses that made my heart punch against my ribs. The first envelope I grabbed had my name on it, Mr. Noah Carter. The address was correct. The postmark date was from 10 years ago. My hand started shaking so hard I could barely tear it open. The paper inside was slightly yellowed, the ink bleeding where water had seeped into the edges, but the first line was still perfectly clear. Dear Noah, we are pleased to inform you. My vision blurred. I blinked hard, forced myself to refocus, and read more. You have been accepted to the class of full tuition scholarship, housing included, orientation information enclosed. The world narrowed to a pinprick. My breathing got loud in my own ears. I grabbed another letter, and another, and another. Different schools, different offers. Some with partial scholarships, one with a full ride and a stipend. One from that university, the one that had felt like a sacred name in my mouth as a teenager. They were all here, every single one of them. 10 years worth of dust and water damage, 10 years of a life I'd been told I wasn't good enough for, sitting in a moldy cardboard box above my head. You can know something without knowing it. You can suspect, you can wonder, but there is a physical difference between doubt and proof, between maybe I messed up and the hard, sharp weight of they did this to me. In that attic, on my knees, clutching handfuls of soggy acceptance letters, that line disappeared forever. They had come. The letters had come. I hadn't been too average. I hadn't been rejected. My future had arrived neatly addressed, and they had taken it, opened it, and hidden it away. My parents hadn't just discouraged me. They had actively stolen my chance to leave. Stolen years. Stolen choices. Stolen a version of me that might have existed somewhere else, on a campus lawn, in a lab, in a lecture hall. Heat flooded my body, so intense I thought for a second I might throw up. Noah, Dad called again from below. What's taking so long up there? For the first time in a decade, I didn't swallow it down. I didn't make my voice small. I clutched one of the letters so tightly the paper crinkled, climbed back toward the hatch, and stared down into the face of the man who told me life just didn't work that way. I had no idea then that this discovery, this damp box of ghosts, would be the beginning of something far bigger than a confrontation. I only knew one thing with the kind of cold, clear certainty that changes everything. They had decided, without me, what my life would be. And I was done letting them. I don't remember climbing down the ladder. One moment I was in the attic on my knees, surrounded by a ring of letters like some kind of twisted altar. And the next, my feet hit the hallway floor, and I was standing there, chest heaving, clutching one crumpled envelope in my fist. Dad was leaning against the wall by the thermostat, arms folded, as if he'd been waiting for me to report back on the leak. His eyes flicked to the letter in my hand. Just for a second. It was enough. "What's that?" he asked. My voice came out rough. "You tell me." I held the envelope up, my hand shaking. The university crest glinted faintly in the dim hallway light. His gaze hardened, his jaw tightening in a way I hadn't seen since he yelled at a customer for writing a bad check. "I asked you to check the roof, not snoop through our things," he said. "Our things." Something in me snapped at that. "These are my things," I shot back. "My name is on them. My address. My future." The words poured out of me faster than I could shape them. Mom appeared at the end of the hall, wiping her hands on a dish towel, frown already forming like she'd walked into the middle of a tantrum she was too tired to deal with. "What's going on?" she asked. I turned toward her. My fist clenched around the letter so tightly the paper dug into my skin. "Did you both think I'd never find out?" I said. "That the roof would hold forever? That this box would just rot up there until the whole house came down?" Mom's eyes darted from my face to the paper in my hand, then to Dad. Her pupils shrank. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't have gone through the attic boxes," she said. "They're not for you. They were never meant for you," Dad added, as if clarifying something reasonable. I laughed then. It was an ugly sound, harsh and cracked, the kind of laugh that comes right before a breakdown. "Not meant for me," I repeated. "Letters addressed to me, acceptance letters, scholarships. You read them, didn't you? You opened them, and then what? Decided for me? Just quietly tossed them in a box like old Christmas decorations?" They didn't answer. Silence rushed in, loud and suffocating. For years I'd wondered if maybe I just wasn't good enough. If the universe had taken one look at my ambitions and said, "No, thanks." Finding that box was like watching the universe shrug and point directly at my parents. Mom broke first. Her voice went high and sharp, that brittle tone she only used when she felt cornered. "We did what was best for you," she snapped. "Those places would have eaten you alive. You think some fancy college cares about a boy from here? They'd use you up and spit you out and leave you with nothing but debt and disappointment. That's not your decision to make, I said. My heart was pounding so hard my vision pulsed. You don't get to. We're your parents, Dad cut in. Of course it's our decision. You were 18, barely out of diapers. You don't know the first thing about the world. Neither do you. I fired back. The words echoed down the narrow hallway like a gunshot. Dad's eyes went flat. Mom flinched as if I'd thrown something. Regret flared in my gut for half a second, reflexive and old, but anger burned hotter. You kept every letter, I said, voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. You didn't tear them up. You didn't throw them away. You hid them, which means you knew. You knew I got in. You knew they wanted me. You knew I had a shot, and you lied. You watched me think I wasn't good enough, and you said nothing. Mom's expression flickered, something vulnerable struggling under the surface, but then she shook her head, hard, and the wall slammed back into place. We saved you, she insisted. Do you have any idea how many people I've seen ruined by those places? Running back home with their tail between their legs? Or worse, never coming back at all? Her voice cracked on that last word, worse. Suddenly, between the anger and the betrayal, another possibility slid into focus. Is that what this is about? I asked. You were afraid I wouldn't come back? Silence. Mom looked away. Dad stared at the floor. There it was. Under all the talk about debt and brainwashing and people like us, there it was. Raw, selfish fear. Fear of being left behind. Fear of being exposed as small in a world that was bigger than Main Street and the high school parking lot. You would have left us, Mom whispered. You always had your head in the clouds, always acting like you were better than this town, than us. Once you got a taste of that life, you wouldn't have come back. We'd have lost you. You lost me anyway, I said. My voice came out low, almost calm. It frightened me a little, that stillness. You didn't just keep me from leaving. You cut 10 years out of my life without asking. 10 years I could have spent learning something more than spark plugs and oil changes. 10 years I could have been building something. 10 years of a version of me I'll never meet because you decided you were more afraid of being alone than you were of me being stuck. Dad's nostrils flared. You're being dramatic. You stole my mail, I said, each word heavy. You lied to my face. You let me think I'd failed. You did fail, he snapped. You failed to see what was right in front of you. Family, responsibility, not these pipe dreams. You mean not your dream, I corrected. Mom's eyes filled, glistening, but she didn't let the tears fall. You're ungrateful, she whispered. We gave you everything, a roof over your head, food, a job, safety. Other kids would kill for that. I didn't ask for safety, I said. I asked for a chance. The towel slipped from her fingers, landing on the hallway floor with a soft thud that sounded like the end of something. In that narrow, dim hallway, with the yellowed letters crinkling in my fist, some invisible thread snapped between us. Not a clean cut, more like something that had been fraying for years, finally giving way. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. I turned, walked into my room, and closed the door. My breaths came shallow and fast. My hands were buzzing like I'd stuck them in an electrical socket. On my desk, my phone buzzed with some meaningless notification. I stared at it like it belonged to someone else. In the attic, under a leaking roof, I'd found proof that my parents had once believed I was capable of leaving, capable enough to be dangerous. They'd believed in me just enough to fear me, and fear had turned them into thieves. I don't remember sleeping that night. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks of the house, wondering how many of those sounds had been secrets shifting above my head all these years. In the morning, I packed. Not much. Just clothes, the letters I could salvage, my worn copy of a physics textbook Mrs. Patel had given me as a graduation present, and a photograph of me and my best friend from high school, Jamie, on the day we'd both sworn we were going to get out. He'd left, I'd stayed. Now I knew why. When I stepped into the kitchen with the duffel bag slung over my shoulder, Mom was at the table with a cup of coffee, dark circles under her eyes. Dad stood by the sink, staring out the window. Neither of them looked particularly surprised. "Where are you going?" Mom asked, voice rough. "Away," I said. "You don't have any money," Dad said. "You've barely saved anything. You won't last a month out there." I shrugged. "Then I won't. That'll be my failure, not yours to prevent." He made a scoffing sound, like I'd said something childish. "Don't do this, Noah," Mom whispered. "You're angry. You'll calm down. You always do." Her always told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't the first time I'd tried to push back. It was just the first time I had proof big enough to stand on. "I'll send you the address when I land somewhere," I said, "if you want it." "What about the shop?" Dad demanded. "What about your responsibilities?" I looked at him, really looked. At the grease ingrained in his knuckles, the oil-stained shirt, the lines carved deep around his mouth from years of clenching his jaw. "I've been taking responsibility for your choice for 10 years, I said softly. "It's time you take responsibility for mine." I walked out, my heart pounding in my throat. The screen door slammed behind me with a clap that felt like the closing of a chapter. There was no dramatic roadside epiphany, no moment where the clouds parted and the universe told me exactly what to do. There was just a bus timetable, my meager savings, and a gnawing determination not to let the theft of my first chance justify me ignoring every other chance life might hand me. I didn't go straight to the university whose crest had haunted me for a decade. That would make for a cleaner story, but reality is messier. First, I went to the closest city with a community college and a temp agency. I took the cheapest room I could find, a dingy studio with peeling paint and a suspicious smell in the hallway, and I got to work. Day shifts in warehouses, night classes, weekends tutoring high school kids in math to scrape together extra cash. I was 28, sitting in a classroom full of 18-year-olds, starting from scratch. The shame burned at first. Every time someone asked, "So why are you just starting now?" I felt the old humiliation clawing at my throat. Eventually, I got tired of lying. "My parents hid my acceptance letters," I said once, surprising myself. "I thought I hadn't gotten in. Turns out I had, so now I'm catching up." The girl who'd asked, a nursing major with a nose ring and an honest face, blinked. "That's messed up," she said bluntly. "It is," I agreed. And then something unexpected happened. She didn't look at me like I was broken. She looked at me like I was determined, like my being there, despite everything, said something about who I was. That changed something inside me. Community college wasn't glamorous, but it was oxygen. I devoured every class I could take. Math, computer science, economics. I stayed late in the computer lab, eyes gritty, hands flying over the keyboard. No more secrets, no more asking permission. 2 years in, one of my professors pulled me aside. "There's a transfer program," he said, sliding a flyer across the desk. The logo at the top made my breath hitch. It wasn't the same university from my acceptance letters, but it was related, a partner campus in the state system, a place that shared faculty, research, a pipeline. "Your grades are high enough," the professor went on. "You've got recommendations. You should go for it." The old fear rose up inside me like a reflex. Applications, mailboxes, letters that never came. "Do they email decisions now?" I asked, trying for a joke and failing. He smiled. Mostly. I applied. I pressed submit on a web form, watched the confirmation page load, and stood there for a long time afterwards staring at the screen as if I could will it into granting me the 10 years I'd lost. When the acceptance email came, I wasn't at a mailbox. I was standing in a break room at the warehouse, holding a cracked coffee mug. My phone vibrated, screen lighting up with the subject line. "Congratulations, Noah." For a second, the walls blurred. The fluorescent lights buzzed too loudly. I sank into a plastic chair and read it 3 times, just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting it. It wasn't the full ride I'd once been offered as a teenager, but there was some financial aid, enough to make it possible if I kept working, kept tutoring, kept living cheap. I forwarded the email to myself, then to an empty folder I'd named Proof. Proof that, in an alternate timeline, I might have been reading something similar 10 years earlier. I didn't tell my parents. Not then. Not yet. Instead, I quietly filed the transfer forms, gave my 2 weeks' notice at the warehouse, hugged the few friends I'd made in that city, and bought a one-way bus ticket. The campus wasn't what I'd imagined when I was 17. It was more sprawling, less polished. There were weeds between the cracks in the sidewalks, construction cranes in the distance. But the first time I stepped into a lecture hall and heard a professor talk about systems thinking like it was the most natural language in the world, I felt something inside me click. I was home, in a way I'd never been on Main Street. The years that followed were a blur of work. Classes, part-time jobs, late nights in the library, research assistant gigs with grouchy postdocs who barely looked up from their screens. I gravitated toward the intersection of tech and education, not just fixing machines, but building systems that could teach, track, adapt. Maybe it was inevitable. When your own education has been stolen, you either turn bitter or you turn obsessed with making sure no one else gets shut out the way you did. I chose obsession. By the time I graduated in my early 30s, I had a degree, a pile of student debt, and an idea I couldn't shake. What if there was a way to use technology to scaffold people like me? Late bloomers, first-gen students, people whose path to higher education wasn't neat or linear. An advisor introduced me to someone in the city, an angel investor who'd made his money in early ed tech. We met in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and ambition. "What's your story?" he asked, after I'd stumbled through a clumsy pitch full of jargon. I hesitated, then told him the truth. All of it. The letters, the attic, the leak, the late start, the years at the shop, breathing in fumes instead of ideas. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he sipped his coffee and said, "You're angry." "Yes," I said. "Good," he replied. "Anger plus intelligence plus a problem to solve is fuel. Let's see what you can build with it." That was how my second life started. The company began in a cramped co-working space with mismatched chairs and free stale donuts on Fridays. We built software that could flag at-risk students before they fell through the cracks. Not just based on grades, but on patterns, attendance, engagement, tiny signals that taken together could whisper, this person is being pulled away from their potential. We piloted it with community colleges first, then with smaller universities desperate to keep students from dropping out. It wasn't glamorous. There were bugs. There were all-nighters. There were months where we weren't sure we'd make payroll. But slowly, schools started to call us instead of the other way around. "Your tool caught things our advisors missed," one dean told me over Zoom, his voice thick with something that sounded like gratitude. "We kept 50 students who were on their way out the door. That's 50 lives changed, 50 tuitions we didn't lose. That matters." It did. To them. To me. The company grew. We hired staff. We moved into a real office. We signed contracts that had commas in them, in places I'd never seen outside of other people's stories. I traveled more than I slept. Conferences, campus visits, boardroom pitches. And one day, 10 years after I'd found that box in the attic, my assistant slid a thick packet across my desk. "Another university inquiry," she said. "This one's big." I flipped through the first page almost absently, then froze. The logo at the top was burned into my memory. The university whose crest had once been on a letter in my mailbox. The one whose name I'd traced in the dark. The one whose scholarship I'd never known I'd been offered. Now, a decade too late, they were reaching out to me. Not as an applicant, not as a student, as a potential partner. Their enrollment was struggling. Their retention metrics were a mess. Their endowment, while still sizable, had taken hits. They were looking to innovate, to modernize, but underneath the buzzwords, I could hear the quiet panic. They wanted my software. They wanted my company's help. But as I read deeper, something else caught my eye. A brief note about exploring strategic options, including potential partial or full acquisition by private entities. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Acquisition. Not of my company. Of them, of the very institution that had once written, "We are pleased to inform you," and then been cut out of my life by a pair of scissors and a cardboard box. My heart pounded, the old anger and a new, colder calculation mixing in my chest. 10 years ago, they'd wanted me as a student. Now, for the first time, I saw a path, wild, audacious, almost ridiculous, for me to come back in a way my parents could never have imagined. Not as a lost kid finally finding his place, but as the person holding the deed. The idea lodged itself in my chest and refused to move. I sat there in my office with their proposal in my hands, staring at that crest, that name, feeling like time had folded in on itself. For a long time, I didn't do anything. I just let the weight of it settle. Could I really do this? Buying a struggling regional campus wasn't like buying a house. It wasn't like signing a software contract. It was politics and history and donors and faculty senates. It was risk. But underneath all that, underneath the spreadsheets and strategic plans, it was also something else, a way to turn 10 stolen years into something more than just bitterness. The investor who'd backed me at the start had become a friend. I forwarded him the packet and called him the same afternoon. He whistled when he saw the name. "You aiming high, kid?" "I'm not a kid," I said automatically, then caught myself. "But yeah, it's personal." I figured. He leaned back in his chair on the video call, steepling his fingers. "You know this is going to be complicated. They're a legacy institution. Even wounded animals bite." "I know," I said, "but I also know they need what we've built, and they're considering selling, at least in part. If we can structure it right, we don't just sell them software. We help run the engine." He stared at me for a beat, then smiled slowly. "Now you sound like a CEO," he said. "All right, let's talk strategy." The next months were a blur of calls and flights. I walked their campus for the first time, not as a wide-eyed 17-year-old hoping to belong, but as a man in his late 30s wearing a visitor badge that said vendor. The first time I stepped through the main gate, my throat tightened. There it was, the arch I'd seen in brochures, the old stone library with ivy creeping up its sides, the quad where students lounged on blankets, earbuds in, laptops open, exactly as they had in the pictures I hid under my mattress. Except now, I wasn't here to ask for permission. I was here to evaluate. Their administration building smelled like old wood and coffee. The president, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes and a stack of slash-and-burn budget reports on her desk, shook my hand. "We've heard good things about your company," she said. "Our board is nervous about outside involvement, but the status quo isn't working." I looked around her office. Framed diplomas, photos of beaming graduates, a whiteboard with too many arrows and not enough answers. "I know what it's like when the status quo doesn't work," I said quietly. She didn't ask for that story. I didn't offer it. Not yet. Instead, we talked numbers. We talked about student attrition and the cost of recruiting versus retaining. We talked about leveraging technology not as a bandage, but as a backbone. Behind the official meetings, my investor worked the other side. He talked to trust lawyers and bondholders, to board members who understood that if they didn't adapt, the university would quietly bleed out over the next decade. "You're not buying them outright," he reminded me one night over dinner. "You're becoming a controlling partner, advisory rights, operational oversight on student success and digital strategy. We let them keep their history. We help them survive the future." It wasn't about slapping my name on a building. It was about reshaping how that building functioned. The deal came together, brick by brick. My company committed capital and technology. The university committed to restructuring. The board, after a lot of grumbling and a few dramatic speeches about outsider influence, finally voted yes. The day the final documents were signed, I sat in a conference room at a downtown law firm, pen in hand, staring at a stack of paper an inch thick. On the first page, in dense legal language, was a sentence that boiled down to this: I now held a controlling stake in the entity that ran the university that had once accepted me and then, by proxy, been kept forever out of reach. "Congratulations," the lawyer said when the last signature dried. "You're now, in many ways, the owner of an institution older than your great-grandfather." I put the pen down slowly. Owner. The word felt wrong and right all at once. You can't really own a place like that. Not in the way you own a car or a house. You're a steward, a caretaker passing through. But still, there it was. Legally, financially, structurally, I had a say now. I walked to the window and looked down at the city. In the distance, if I squinted, I could see the top of the old bell tower on campus. 10 years ago, that tower had been a dream. Now, in a way that would have been incomprehensible to the kid pumping gas at his dad's shop, it answered to me. The petty part of me wanted to drive straight to my parents' house, slam the deed on their kitchen table, and watch their faces crumble. The older part of me, the one that had built something out of anger and then learned to live with less of it, knew that wouldn't change what had already happened. But forgiveness didn't mean silence. They deserved to know. I hadn't spoken to them much in the intervening decade. A few stiff holiday calls, a couple of terse texts when distant relatives died. I hadn't told them about community college, or transferring, or the company, or the growing list of universities using my software. They'd chosen to keep me small in their minds. I'd chosen not to correct them. This time, I did. I didn't warn them I was coming. I just got in my car one Saturday and drove back to that town with the 2 stoplights and the blinking diner sign. Nothing much had changed. The houses looked a little more tired. The shop had a new sign, but the same gravel lot. When I pulled up, Dad was outside, hosing down the concrete. Mom was at the counter, head bent over a ledger. For a second, standing there with my hand on the car door, I felt like I was 18 again, about to walk in and ask for something I knew they didn't want to give. Then I remembered the feel of the pen in my hand signing those acquisition papers. I stepped out and closed the door quietly. Dad glanced up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before it hardened into something between defensiveness and wariness. "Noah," he said. "Hey, Dad." Mom came to the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel like she always had. For a split second, her expression softened. Then she saw my clothes, my car, the watch on my wrist, and I saw it, the quick, involuntary calculation. "How? Who are you now?" "You're back," she said. "For a visit," I replied. "I wanted to tell you something in person." Dad snorted. "You married that rich investor lady?" I almost laughed. It was such a neat encapsulation of how he saw the world. "No," I said. "I built a company. We help universities keep students from falling through the cracks. They've been buying our software for years." Mom frowned. "Universities?" "Yeah." I took a breath, including the one that sent me this. I pulled a folder from under my arm and slid an old acceptance letter out, the paper carefully flattened and now in a plastic sleeve. Her eyes widened as she recognized it. "I found the rest, by the way," I said quietly. "In the attic, 10 years ago." Silence fell like a curtain. Dad's jaw set. Mom's face went pale. "You didn't have the right," she started, "to climb into my own attic?" I cut in. "To find my own mail?" I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, but my voice stayed level. "I spent a long time being angry," I went on. "Longer than I want to admit. I thought if I ever came back here, it would be to scream, or to show you exactly how much you misjudged me." Dad crossed his arms. "We did what we thought was best." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." They both looked thrown by that. "When you hide acceptance letters because you're afraid your kid will leave," I continued, "you're not protecting them. You're protecting yourself from having to sit with your own fear. You didn't save me from debt. You saved yourselves from being left behind." Mom's lips trembled. "You would have left," she whispered. "I left anyway," I said. "The difference is I left thinking I'd failed. I left thinking I wasn't good enough to go anywhere else, that I'd somehow imagined the whole thing. You stole not just my options, but my sense of my own worth." They both flinched, as if the words were physical blows. "I'm not here to make you feel bad," I added, surprising myself with the truth of it. "I'm here to tell you what I did with what was left." I told them about community college, about transferring, about the investor in the coffee shop who'd said my anger was fuel. I told them about building a company from a garage desk to an office with a view, about the first contract, the first large campus, the first time I stood on a stage at an education conference and talked about catching the kids everyone else missed. They listened in a stunned, hollow kind of silence. "When you said you knew better about my future," I said, "you assumed the only path for a kid from here was to take over the family business or fail. You never considered that I might build something you couldn't even imagine, that I might walk into the offices of people with degrees and donors and say, 'Here's how we can do this better.'" Dad's shoulders sagged a fraction. "And now?" he asked, almost a whisper. "What now?" I held his gaze. "Now," I said, "that university you kept me from receiving a full scholarship to? They were struggling. They reached out to my company for help, and last month, after a lot of negotiation, I signed a deal. I now have a controlling stake in the entity that runs them. I sit on the board. I sign off on decisions you once told me were for people like them." Mom made a small, strangled sound. "You," she stopped, swallowed. "You own that college? Not in the way you own this shop," I said. "But yes, in the way that matters when it comes to its future." I pulled another document from the folder. Not the full agreement, just the glossy press release the university's communications team had put together. They'd used the words strategic partnership and transformative leadership, because that's what those departments do. But my name was there, my company's name. The photo of me shaking hands with the president under the arch. Mom's fingers shook as she took it. Dad hovered behind her as they both stared. For a moment, I could see it land. The boy they'd expected to mop floors forever at the shop had gone and signed papers in glass towers they'd only ever seen on TV. It wasn't petty satisfaction I felt. It was something quieter, sadder. "This isn't about rubbing your noses in it," I said. "I don't get those 10 years back. I don't get my 18-year-old self back, but I do get to decide what kind of man I am now. And I needed you to know that who I became happened not because you stopped me, but in spite of it." Dad looked up, his eyes suddenly red-rimmed. "We were scared," he muttered, voice cracking. No one in our family ever." "I know," I repeated, "and I can have compassion for where that fear came from without pretending it didn't hurt me. Both things can be true." Mom's tears finally spilled over. "We thought we'd lose you," she whispered, "that you'd go off and forget us, that we'd be left here with nothing but an empty shop and neighbors whispering about how we let you leave." "You were always going to lose me," I said softly, "because that's what raising a person is, letting them grow into someone you don't fully control. You could have lost me to a lecture hall at 18 and gained a son who called home from dorm rooms. Or you could lose me to resentment and secrets in a cardboard box in the attic. You chose the latter." The words hung between us, stark and unadorned. I thought of all the first-gen kids I'd met in the years since, students who'd fought families, culture, poverty, doubt, and felt a wave of fierce protective anger on their behalf. "I'm making sure this doesn't happen to other people," I added. "That's what the company is for. That's what we're doing at the university now. We're building programs for kids like me, for parents like you who are scared. We're putting advisors and software and support in place so the decision to go or stay is made with information, not fear." A small, almost broken laugh escaped me. "Hell," I said, "we're literally piloting a program there now for first-generation students whose parents think college is a cult. We bring the parents in, we walk them through what it really is. We show them the numbers, the outcomes, the risks and benefits. We treat them like adults capable of understanding, not children in need of protection." Mom sat down heavily on a chair by the doorway. "I don't expect you to forgive us," she said after a long moment, voice barely audible. "I already have," I answered, and realized I meant it. If I hadn't, I wouldn't be standing here. I just needed you to see the full picture, to know that the story you've been telling yourselves about saving me is not the truth. Dad scrubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. "What now?" he repeated. Do we get to be in your life?" That was the question, wasn't it? I thought of Emma, the nursing student with the nose ring who'd said that's messed up without pity. Of my investors, my team, the faculty committee I'd sat with last week who'd argued fiercely about curriculum changes because they cared. I thought of the campus, of the bell tower, of the kids sprawled on the lawn with their laptops open. I thought of myself, younger, in the library, tracing a crest in the dark. "Maybe," I said slowly. "Maybe. But it's going to be on different terms. No more secrets. No more mail you forget to mention. No more pretending your fear is my fate." Mom nodded, tears streaming quietly down her face. "You'll let us know when." She gestured vaguely with the press release. "When things happen? With the school? With your life?" "I'll think about it," I said. "Right now, my main priority is making sure other kids' parents see more possibilities than you did. That's where my energy goes." They both looked like they wanted to argue, to ask for a share of that energy, but for once, they didn't. Maybe they finally understood that some choices carry consequences even a decade later. I left the folder on the counter. As I walked back to my car, the air felt different, lighter. Not because anything had been fixed. You can't fix the past. But because I'd finally said out loud what had been strangling me since the day I'd opened that soggy box. On the drive back to campus, my phone buzzed. It was an email from the university president. Subject line, "First cohort numbers, you'll want to see this." In the body were early data from the new first-gen support program we'd implemented. Retention numbers were up already. Fewer students had dropped or disappeared. More had shown up to advisor meetings who previously would have ghosted. The president had added a single line at the end. Your story is already changing others. I pulled over on the side of the road and let that sink in. My story. For a long time, it had felt like something done to me. A thing I carried in secret, heavy and embarrassing. Now, for the first time, it felt like something I was actively writing. Later that semester, the university held a small event on the quad, a sort of unofficial welcome to our new direction gathering for staff and students. They asked me to say a few words. I stood under the bell tower, the stone cool at my back, and looked out at the small crowd. Professors in cardigans, students with backpacks, maintenance staff leaning on rakes. I told them about the software and the strategy, sure, the boring but important details about data and support structures. But then, without planning to, I shared the rest. I was supposed to be here a long time ago, I said. At 18, not 38, my acceptance letters got lost in transit. Not in the postal system, in my own house. There was a ripple of uncomfortable laughter, a few shocked gasps. I'm not telling you that for sympathy, I went on. I'm telling you because I know some of you are standing at the edge of choices other people are trying to make for you. Parents, partners, neighbors, fearful voices saying, people like us don't do things like that. I paused, feeling the weight of 100 eyes. I can't go back and change what happened to me, I said, but I can help change what happens to you. That's why I'm here. Not as some absentee investor trying to squeeze more tuition money out of you. As someone who knows what it feels like to have your path narrowed for you, I'm here to widen it. Afterward, a student approached me, nervous, clutching her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles were white. My dad says college is a waste, she said in a rush. That I should just marry my boyfriend and work at his cousin's restaurant. He won't come to campus, won't meet my advisor. He says they'll fill my head with nonsense. My chest ached at the familiarity of it. Have you told anyone here that? I asked. She shook her head. Tell them, I said. Tell your advisor. Tell your RA. Tell the people whose job it is to fight for you. That's why we're building what we're building, so you don't have to do it alone. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. As she walked away, I looked up at the tower. Somewhere in a landfill or an incinerator, the original copies of my letters were probably long gone. The soggy versions I'd salvaged were in a fireproof box now, not because I needed the proof anymore, but because they'd become part of the story I tell when I talk to donors and boards about why access matters. I don't stand in front of them and say, my parents are villains. That's not the point. I say, fear and ignorance are powerful. So is love. We have to build systems that help the latter win. At night, when campus is quiet and the lawns are empty, I sometimes walk under that archway alone. I run my fingers over the carved stone, feel the grooves worn smooth by 100 years of hands. In another life, I would have done this at 18, exhausted from finals, joking with dorm mates at 2 a.m. In this life, I do it as a man who took the long way around. I can't get those 10 years back. But I've realized something else. Those 10 years didn't just vanish, they transformed. They became the fuel that built a company. They became the reason a tired university president picked up the phone and called someone like me. They became the foundation of programs that mean a kid sitting in a house like mine, in a town like mine, gets a text, an email, a knock on their door, before their letters are metaphorically or literally boxed up and hidden away. And every time I see a student cross the quad wearing a first-gen pin we designed, laughing with a parent who once thought this place would eat their kid alive, I feel something loosen in my chest. My parents' fear narrowed my path. My work now is to widen everyone else's. A leak in the roof exposed a lie. Owning the consequences of that lie reshaped my life. Owning a piece of the university they stole from me? That's just the poetic part.